It's Friday, 10th July 2020. Thank you for joining us. This is Oromo Media Network. We're coming to you live from our studios in Kenya. My name is Asli Galgalo. The Ethiopian government has been praised for its reforms in the recent past. The Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed released political prisoners, journalists, lifted the ban on previously outlawed political parties, and even ended the border stalemate with neighboring Eritrea. This earned him a Nobel Peace Prize. However, journalists and critics of the government continue to face arbitrary arrest, illegal and prolonged detention, and unfair trial. Just a week ago, a lot of people were killed after the aftermath of Achalu's murder. The Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other bodies continue to document the human rights violation in Ethiopia. Ethiopia's security forces have been accused of carrying out arbitrary arrest, extrajudicial execution, forced eviction, and destruction of property belonging to people suspected of supporting opposition parties or armed groups. Continuation of massive human rights violation in Ethiopia, and especially in Oromia, has led to worldwide protest, and with Oromos complaining, or rather expressing their dissatisfaction with how the government is responding to their grievances. Joining me now is Dr. Trevor Truman, the chairman of Oromia Support Group, who's been reporting on the violence, or rather on human rights abuses in Ethiopia for over 30 years. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Trevor.
Good evening, or good afternoon, I think.
Good afternoon to you. The first question is, you've been recording the human rights abuses in Ethiopia for decades. What has the trend been like?
Right. Well, it's not been quite 30 years. The Oromo Support Group was set up in 1994, although I was concerned with abuses since before the downfall of the Derg in 1991. The trend, it's very disappointing and very depressing to see a return basically to 1992, 1993 now, with large numbers of extrajudicial killings and massive detention, and again the use of rape and torture and pillage in terms of oppressing the Oromo people. And again, it's using the excuse of labeling people as terrorists if they're even politically against the government. Legal political parties, including the OLF now, which is legal, but Oromo Federalist Congress, and their officers and their supporters have been detained and sometimes killed. It's alarmingly depressing. I have great difficulty finding words to describe my feelings about all this. As you can imagine, having worked on this for over 26 years now, and having seen the huge changes that were achieved over the last few years, especially by the Oromo students, since the demonstrations of 2014, and then from the end of 2015 throughout 2016. And it was those demonstrations that brought about change in Ethiopia, with the coming onto the scene of Abiy Ahmed, when the TPLF basically withdrew and Haile Mariam Desalegn took over. But it's very disappointing to see the gains that were made by the students in terms of the voices not only of Oromo but all the peoples of Ethiopia being heard, and a recognition of the different peoples of Ethiopia that has been established since the TPLF came to power in 1991. It's much more plural sort of space Ethiopia has been, and now seeing not only a return to the abuses that were occurring in especially 92 and 93, not only a return to that, but a return to views that were held before 1991. Old Derg ideas of a monolithic, monochromatic Ethiopia with one religion, one alphabet, one language. And this is clearly not the wish of the majority of the people of Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shocking turn of events, as we've seen in the killings over the last week, of course.
Yeah, so you've interviewed victims before. If you could just highlight some of the first-hand accounts of the abuses you've recorded, abuses and torture.
Oh, in the early days, we got a lot of information right from Oromo and other places in Ethiopia. Brave individuals sent reports of human rights abuses, often using a clandestine network of reporters called Gadado, and they worked closely with the Urgi newspaper. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. And Gadado used to send us, Gadado and another organization called Salam used to send us reports which they gathered from various corners of Oromo mainly. But then the information from within Ethiopia dried up because of the tight control that TPLF had over communications largely. And so I was invited by the Oromo Relief Association to interview refugees, which I did so in Kenya, Djibouti, Somaliland, South Africa and Egypt. And that was where the majority of interviews that I've done have taken place. I think it was 187 I did over there. And the stories that I received firsthand from people in terms of rape and torture and killing and detention, it fits a pattern throughout abusive regimes and throughout Oromo, and that is a pattern that I'm seeing and recognizing now. Exactly the same is happening. Soldiers walking into people's huts and homes, barely exchanging views, just beating people, shooting people and arresting them. And on the suspicion that somebody in that home supports the, well, used to be that they'd only go for people who were helping the Oromo Liberation Army, which broke away from the OLF after 2018. But now it's anybody who's got a hint of supporting the Oromo Liberation Front and anybody who's supportive of any Oromo political party. And the Oromo Federalist Congress is now coming under attack, as we've seen last week with the arrests and detention of Bekele Garba and Jawar Mohammed.
So there are over 80 ethnic groups in Ethiopia, and people keep wondering, why is it the Oromos only? Oromos are actually the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, but the only ones who've been protesting over the years the human rights violation in the country. Why do you think this is the case?
Well, that's not quite strictly true. Over the years, every group of people in Ethiopia, including Tigrayans, has been subject to human rights abuses, and severe and prolonged human rights abuses. The smaller groups like Anwak and medium-sized groups like the Sidama, often we don't hear as much information about the abuses against those peoples, but they're going on. Beni Shangul is another example. The reason we hear so much about Oromo human rights abuses in the past has been because the numbers of people involved has been so massive. It's not only because the Oromo are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, but they were subject of the worst prevalence of human rights abuse, apart from the Ogaden people. Per capita, the abuses were worse in the Ogaden than they've been in Oromo. But now it seems to be that the Oromo are seen as the biggest threat to this new political model that Abiy Ahmed has for Ethiopia, this unified Ethiopia, and he sees them as the biggest threat, and therefore they're coming in for the worst abuses. One thing that was pointed out to me by an official from Amnesty International quite recently is that it's important not to weaponize human rights abuses, to use them as a tool in a fight. We must not do that. We must see human rights abuses as being evil for what they are, and not as a tool for gaining leverage for one political group or one ethnic group over another. Having said that, it is important to recognize the existence of those abuses without increasing the antagonism between the different peoples involved. The elephant in the room in Ethiopia that has been there for over 100 years is deep-seated hostility and racism between Amharas and Oromo, and between Oromo and Amhara. And until that problem is addressed, we will not get a peaceful solution to what's happening in Ethiopia. It's important to recognize this hostility and racism without making it worse. The last thing I want to do is to make people more angry and more likely to condone violence, because in the end it's dialogue that's going to sort this out, and it would be a lot better to sort it out with dialogue now rather than killing thousands and thousands of people and then sorting it out with dialogue. But the solution to this has to be political, and it has to be done by dialogue rather than fighting.
Yeah, so everyone wants that, so that we want harmony in Ethiopia. But now when Abiy first came to power, there was this hope, which is now fading day by day. The same government that released people in thousands is arresting in the same magnitude. In his address to Parliament last week, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "Oromo people don't need armed struggle anymore because they are free." However, we've seen a new wave of arrests and killings that target Oromo nationalists. As a person who's been following this for years, do you think Oromos are free?
They're certainly not free. But there has certainly been progress. And the OLF achieved a great deal in their single year in power in the transitional government from mid-91 to 92. If you had spoken to me in the late 80s and said that there would be an officially recognized area of Ethiopia called Oromia, in which the official language would be Afan Oromo, if you'd have suggested that to most people, they would have laughed at you. But these are facts. These are achievements that have been attained. And eventually, we will have the present day Ethiopia lived in by people peacefully together who don't care whether they're Oromo, Amhara, Sidama or whatever. Eventually that will happen, I truly believe. But that happen, and achievements that we made over the last 20 years, as you have pointed out, have been sadly reversed in the last few months. It's very disappointing to see journalists labeling the OLF, or wanting to label the OLF, as a terrorist organization now, and these journalists were people for whom I campaigned for their release alongside Amnesty International. some over several years. And it's very disappointing to see these very people that we campaigned for the release of being responsible for stirring up hatred against the Oromo people.
Yeah.
And the very people who deny the cruel oppression and overrunning of territories south of the old limits of Abyssinia, when, what, 2/3 of Ethiopia was colonized over 100 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
And people who refuse to accept that, that happened are the very people who are accusing Oromo nationalists of being terrorists now. It's a paradoxical situation. And the only solution is, as I say, dialogue and getting an agreed history and agreeing on holding democratic elections, democratic representative elections. I had high hopes for the elections in May of this year, but the virus has put pay to that, and now we have the current unrest, which will probably be used as a reason for postponing even further. But we need free and fair elections and free and fair canvassing prior to those elections. We don't need a political system and political masters being imposed from above. That would just add fuel to the flames, and well, who knows when it will stop. I've been warning about the dangers of large-scale conflict in Ethiopia between groups for many years, and this is the most depressed I've been about that possibility at the moment.
Mm-hmm. You just talk about the hope of free and fair elections, but as you know, the elections were postponed indefinitely. People at home and both the international community were really looking forward to this election, not just for who wins, but, you know, the peaceful transition of the process under new government. But now the unrest that we're witnessing in the country is being linked to the postponement of the election. Is that what you think as well?
I think that's making things worse. It was inevitable that this wretched virus would postpone things. Mm-hmm. But the virus apart, we must get on with these elections as soon as is humanly possible, because therein lies the solution, I believe, so that people can feel that their opinion is taken note of.
Mm-hmm. So after a lot of people were killed last week, some are terming it as a genocide. Yes, we appreciate the strides that made by the Oromo people. You said in the 1990s, people would even laugh at you for saying Oromia would be a region. Can this killing, or the killing that has been going on, which is actually going on, be termed as genocide?
This is a topic that we've returned to off and on. Mm-hmm. In the late 90s, I started using the term genocide, and I joined an organization called the International Association of Genocide Scholars, mm-hmm. and went to 3 biannual international conferences. And I corresponded with some experts. I sent them information about what was happening in Oromia, and the consensus, experts were reluctant to use the word genocide. As one Holocaust investigator pointed out, if everything is genocide, then nothing is genocide. And although the legal definition of genocide includes the deliberate destruction of a part of a people, not the whole, mm-hmm. You could, if you use the term genocide, you could perhaps justify it grammatically, but in the larger scheme of things, I think it's probably not a good idea to use that term, because people will accuse us of exaggerating and sensational things. But I can understand people wishing to use that term, because in some interpretations of the definition it would fit. But as I say, most genocide scholars do not believe it would fit that definition.
So part of the reforms that came with the Prime Minister was the closure of Maekelawi, the notorious torture chamber. But the same torture chamber is now holding Jawar Mohammed and team. So is the Prime Minister going back on his word, or is this, what should we call it? It is question the promise for reform?
Well, it's, I don't know if exactly the same rooms are being used at Maekelawi, or whether they've opened up another facility in the compound of the 3rd police station. I don't know. But obviously Maekelawi's closure was premature, as was the Nobel Peace Prize. We see a return to exactly the same situation as in 1992. The Oromo are given a bit of breathing space, they're listened to, and then supporters of the OLF, in this case, come back into Ethiopia, or come out of the woodwork. They become obvious, they're made public, only to be shot down again a few months later. And yes, the reuse of Maekelawi and the rekindling of the horror of that word, which just immediately means torture and death. Maekelawi has always sent, the use of that word has always sent cold shivers up my spine ever since I first heard what was done there. And to hear of people going back is, it is back to square one, isn't it?
Sorry, we just lost the link there. Another promise that the PM made was to ensure there's freedom of expression and media freedom. That is why most of the medias that were in exile returned back home, like Oromo Media Network. But now we're seeing several journalists being detained for their opinions or for criticizing the government. For instance, Oimen was closed for allegedly inciting violence, and a Kenyan journalist, Yasin Juma, was arrested while covering the protest of Achalu's death. Again, we're looking at, is this a betrayal of the promise of reforms?
Well, you've answered your own question. Obviously it is. We're going back to how it was when the OLF were overrun as troops in 1992, and the cadres and officials were just shot dead in the offices. And it's, well, very reminiscent of that.
And the unfair trials that are in almost all the cases in Ethiopia, most prisoners who were released say they've never set foot in court. There was no representation whatsoever. So they were just arrested and detained for so long. And Jawar, he said he was denied legal representation. So what does this mean?
It's again a return to the same old pattern. You put people in prison, you don't allow them to communicate with the outside, you don't allow them to see their families, you don't allow them to have legal representation, you don't charge them with anything, you don't allow them to appear in court. And when you do, it's biased, and any judicial decision is overruled by the political party and by the security system. It's no accident that we see the return of the security system being operative abroad as well now. Last week, I think it was the same day that Hachalu was assassinated. 14 or 15 Oromo refugees from Djibouti were snatched and taken back to Ethiopia. Now that has happened on and off ever since 1992, but we haven't seen it since 2016. It's a chilling reminder of the way we've returned to an evil security system which snatches people and kills people.
Yeah, a lot of people have been snatched. And now two Oromo members have been charged with the murder of Achalu. So accountability for years of abuses, including torture, rape, and extrajudicial killings, is clearly a challenge to the government, since no step has been taken to investigate the murder of the 2015-2018 protest, which claimed over 1,000 lives, and no one has been held responsible whatsoever. So will there be consequence for Ethiopia's human rights violations?
I don't know. I don't know. Depressingly, the majority of abusers get away with it. And people often get away with it because the practical way of getting over a period of conflict is to bury it rather than investigate it. We've seen some successes, although some people say they weren't, like the Truth and Rehabilitation Commission in South Africa. It's limited success according to some people, and whether a similar process should happen in Ethiopia or not, I do not know. It's something that we were talking about at the end of 2018. Certainly, I think we need to see some method of human rights education so that the general population in Ethiopia are aware of their rights, of what their country has signed up to in terms of UN conventions. And I would like to see the population educated about that, and a system set up where they could report on abuses carried out by the security services, and a chain on up to Finfinite where those complaints would be taken seriously. At the moment, there is complete impunity, and those who are arrested for any particular act of hostility, I think we have to be very, very careful that they are truly guilty before meting out punishment. I do not have any confidence in the judicial system in Ethiopia now. And the impunity that people have is a vital factor in continuing human rights abuse. If you remove the impunity, then we might see some progress.
Yeah, you're suggesting with education, people could report the human rights injustices that are going on, or the violence that are going on in the country, but bodies like Amnesty has been reporting, and the government has categorically denied the reports coming out of the country. If you remember, when Amnesty released the report, the government slammed it as a mere tale. And this week, when the Prime Minister addressed the Parliament, he denied what is going on in Guji and Waga. So,
yes, well, politicians lie. Does that surprise you?
nah.
Goodness me. Certainly Ethiopian politicians lying, especially about human rights abuses. In fact, it would be a surprise if somebody was honest in that respect. Somebody who has a degree of power in Ethiopia to be honest about human rights abuses. No, that doesn't surprise me at all.
So in Guji and Waga, it's been persistent, especially Waga, since the 1990s. You know, we've seen destruction of property, we've seen houses being burnt.
I've just finished writing this report. It's number 52. We started in 1994, and there are 5 pages of killings in Waga alone. 5 pages, full of people, their stories and pictures of people who have been killed. In April and May, there were 84 killings in Waga alone that we recorded, that I had names of. And there's bound to be many, many more than that. And of course, the killings over the last week, we don't know. The internet has been shut down and communication has been very, very difficult. So yeah.
So why Waga? Some would be curious, you know, why Waga? Because I have a friend whose brothers were killed just Monday in Waga, and the internet shutdown is not making it any easy. So if you could expound on why Waga is an area of interest, why is the killings mostly happening in this region?
I believe the excuse used by the government is that Oromo Liberation Army people, members who were disbanded and as agreed with the Abagadas and elders that they were to be employed in the police or other professions. And where that agreement broke down, I do not know. But I do know that it wasn't long before the government was using bombs on areas where Oromo Liberation Army fighters were meant to be. And I'm quite certain that now it's not, if somebody had been a member of the Oromo Liberation Army, then they are certainly at great risk of being just extrajudicially killed now. But people who are suspected of feeding those fighters, people are suspected of just helping them or giving them directions or speaking to or knowing where they were, they're all at great risk of being killed now. But it's not only that, it's spread. Any Oromo political party now, the OLF, which has been illegal for 2 years, the Oromo Federalist Congress, which has always been illegal and its component parts were originally legal, suspected supporters of those, not only supporters, but suspected supporters are being killed. Brothers, fathers, children of suspected supporters are being killed. Not only killed, they're being tortured, blinded. We have records of 4 of them having their heads cut off after they were killed. Now this is barbaric stuff. And it belongs to the last century. It doesn't belong to the 21st century at all.
Mm-hmm. So before all this, no one mentioned about what is going on in Oromia, or people were not aware, but now it's out there, the world is talking about it. Do you think this has changed anything?
Oh, this is difficult. I used to think when we started talking about human rights abuses in Ethiopia, I thought all we needed to do was get the information out there, that once people knew what was going on, support for the EPRDF government would disappear. And of course, I was completely wrong. Western powers, these that ostensibly prioritize human rights in terms of their foreign policy, do no such thing. It's empty rhetoric, the respect for human rights, by Britain and by America. And I used to think that just by sending the information out, people would automatically stop supporting the EPRDF and would hold it to task about human rights abuses. And of course that was utter nonsense. We spent a lot of time sending information out to different governments and non-governmental organizations, international, national, and people are aware of what's going on. And does it alter their actions? No, I think it makes people just tell different sorts of lies in terms of how they deal with their guilty consciences in terms of foreign policy. I don't believe that we should be quiet about things. It's important to spread the information about human rights abuses in Ethiopia without weaponizing it to whip up racial hatred. That should not be done. But it's important that the information gets out there. so that people are aware and informed. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that it's going to make a big deal of difference from the outside. Most of the change that's occurred in Oromo and Ethiopia, all of it, has occurred from the inside, hasn't it? Often with outside help to belligerent parties. I don't think there's a single government in Ethiopia that hasn't depended quite heavily on international donations and international funds. But even so, I don't expect that to dry up when human rights abuses occur. The change that must happen has to happen from within Oromo and other peoples in Ethiopia, but it's got to start with dialogue and an agreed history.
As much as change is expected, for instance, the Prime Minister in his address again this week on Wednesday said, actually vowed, to wage war on protesters and their leaders by saying, he literally said, if you want war, we will show you what war is. Is this the kind of statement we expect from a Prime Minister or a head of state?
Well, this is exactly what Meles Zenawi said. He said, we are making war on the OLF. I can't remember what year he did. And no, of course not. This is not the language of a peacemaker. This is not the language of a Nobel Peace Prize winner, is it? Mm-hmm. We have to call for elections and dialogue. And we must mobilize every possible bit of support to do that, nationally and internationally, and tell everybody about it.
We're telling everyone about it. Like, Ethiopia is known for its bad human rights record, but the international community is not responding to this, or rather, why are they not taking it with the seriousness that it deserves?
Well, Noam Chomsky said, don't expect to change things with one demonstration, and you can't. It's a persistent process. That's what comes up with the goods. Look at the students and how their struggle from, well, it was well before 2014, wasn't it? The student demonstration through the 90s and the noughties. And only in 2018 did that bring about change. So we just have to keep on keeping on. Demonstrating, protesting, but not violence, because that will only set things back. It won't advance things at all. It might make people feel better at the time, just to be angry and nasty in return, but it does not achieve. I can understand people wanting, but it will not achieve a positive outcome. It'll only set back the solution.
People are trying to change the situation of the country through protest, of course, but these protests are being labeled unlawful. Are they unlawful? And if they are, what other avenues do these people have to highlight their plight?
The demonstrations in 14, 15 and 16 were called unlawful. They were followed up by soldiers doing house-to-house searches and shooting people. And as you say, over 1,000 students were killed in that 3-year period. But it worked. And it will work again. It's civil action and dialogue that will change things, not violence.
The Prime Minister said, we have this avenue, we're trying to transition into a democratic country. So if you want to say something, if you want to air your plight, you should come to a table, have a dialogue. But the whole country cannot come to a table, and you have its leaders in prison. How does this work?
The whole country can go to an election box. That's how it works. And that's how it will work. When there are free and fair elections in Ethiopia, it will be a more stable place. full stop.
So the main thing that people are asking, because everyone is in a dilemma, people are, I do not know what the future holds for Ethiopia, but as for you, what do you think is the way forward for Oromos? How can this situation be improved?
One, don't give up. Two, keep protesting, keep telling people, keep informing. Three, extend your hand to other peoples and talk to them. We've got to start the dialogue.
Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Trevor. He's also known as Dr. Galata, by the way. That is his Oromo name. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Nagati Buli. Thank you.
Nagambul. And thank you for joining us. This has been a discussion about human rights violation with Dr. Trevor Truman, the chair of Oromia Support Group. My name is Asli Galgalo. This is Oromia Media Network. We will continue to bring you up to date on the current situation in Ethiopia. Stay tuned on our pages at Oromo Media Network on Facebook and Twitter, and my page at Asli Galgalo on Facebook and Galgalo Asli on Twitter. Do have a lovely night.
Good night.